The horrific truth behind Scotland's cannibal family. The tale of Sawney Bean is not merely a ghost story whispered around a campfire. It is a raw, festering wound in the fabric of folklore, a nightmare that has seeped into the very soul of Scotland for centuries. Forget your polite cannibals of modern fiction. Hannibal Lecter is a gourmand of refined taste compared to the savage patriarch of the Ayrshire coast. This is the chronicle of a man, Alexander Sawney Bean, who, driven by a profound aversion to honest labor, retreated from society and spawned, through incest, a monstrous dynasty of nearly 50 souls who terrorized the Scottish lowlands for a quarter of a century. To say that the Bean clan was simply a family of murderers is to commit a gross understatement. They were a self-contained ecosystem of depravity, a kingdom carved from darkness, salt, and blood. The legend speaks of over 1,000 victims, travelers, families, innocents, who vanished into the insatiable maw of a cave on the Galloway coast. From the misremembered origins in East Lothian to the final horrific execution in the streets of Edinburgh. This is the deep dive into the bone-littered cave of history, the horrific truth behind a myth that refuses to die, the unmaking of a man. From laborer to monster, Alexander Bean was not born into the shadows. According to the most circulated accounts, specifically those detailed in the macabre pages of London's 18th-century broadsides like the Newgate Calendar, he first drew breath in East Lothian, just a few miles from the civilized sprawl of Edinburgh. He was the son of a manual laborer, a hedger and ditcher, raised to a life of calloused hands and honest sweat. But the soil did not hold Sawney's heart. Described as prone to idleness and viciously inclined, the young Bean found the pastoral life unbearably tedious. This was not a man driven to crime by starvation or desperation, but by a pure, unadulterated hatred for the yoke of civilized work. Rejecting his heritage, Alexander took to the road with a woman as darkly aligned as himself. In the most prevalent version of the tale, her name was Agnes Black Douglas, and she was as sharp and brutal as the wild coastline they would soon call home. Theirs was a union of pure, predatory instinct. Some accounts suggest they met after Bean left home, finding a kindred spirit who had already been denounced as a witch, chased out of towns for the very wickedness that Alexander found so appealing. They wandered for a time, surviving by petty theft and robbery, but these were merely the appetizers for the feast to come. A standard highwayman's life was too pedestrian, too ordinary for their ambitions. It wasn't until they stumbled upon a geographical anomaly that their true nature was allowed to blossom. Fleeing the glare of civilization, they arrived at Benan Head, a treacherous stretch of coastline between the towns of Girvan and Ballantrae, where the land falls away into the churning Irish Sea. The Cathedral of Bones, life in the sea cave. The cave that became the seat of the Bean Empire was not a simple shelter. It was a fortress of nature's design, described as running nearly 200 yards or up to 200 feet deep, depending on the source into the cliff face. Its entrance was a geological trapdoor. At high tide, the waters of the Firth rose up and sealed the opening entirely, submerging it from view. To the fishing boats and the villagers on the shore, there was only rock and sea. They could not have dreamed that behind that curtain of water lurked a den of ravenous monstrosities. For 25 years, the Beans lived in the absolute zero of human society, never setting foot in a city, town, or village. The world outside the cave existed only as a hunting ground. The interior of this lair was a chamber of horrors beyond the ken of modern imagination. It was not simply a dwelling, it was a larder, an abattoir, and a temple to gluttony. The air was thick with the cloying, metallic stench of blood and rot. Human remains were not disposed of with any pretense of dignity. They were the infrastructure of the home. According to the graphic accounts that would later horrify Georgian England, the walls were lined with severed body parts, pickled in brine and hung from the stalactites like ghastly fruit. Limbs were tossed into barrels to preserve the flesh for the leaner winter months, a cannibal's pantry stocked to the brim. The couple were prolific. They did not just live in the cave, they bred in it. Over the years, Black Agnes bore Sawney a staggering number of children, 8 sons and 6 daughters. But incest was the unspoken law of this subterranean hell. With nowhere else to turn, the siblings coupled with siblings. The children of the Beans, 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters, were the twisted products of a family tree that was not a tree at all, but a tangled, gnarled root of pure inbreeding. These were not people. They were drones in a hive of violence, raised from the cradle to see the outside world not as a society of fellow humans, but as a herd of walking meat. The ritual: dispatch, dismemberment, and pickling. The survival of such a large, ever-growing brood required a relentless engine of procurement. The Beans did not hunt sporadically. They operated with an industrialized efficiency. Their preferred method was ambush. Lurking in the shadow of the cliffs and the moorlands that backed the shore, the family would wait for the cover of darkness before descending upon lone travelers or small parties. The violence was swift and absolute. The Beans were not thieves who killed to silence witnesses. They were predators who enjoyed the cruelty. They robbed their victims not because they needed the trinkets, but because the ritual of terror was part of the meal. Once the victim was subdued, the body was not buried. It was dragged back to the cave, the cathedral of bones, where the butchery began immediately. The clan dismembered the corpses, quartering the limbs and torsos like livestock. The usable flesh was stripped, cooked, and devoured in a frenzied feast. What could not be consumed immediately was preserved. The Beans mastered the art of pickling human meat, submerging limbs and organs in barrels of salt water and brine to stay the rot. They smoked flesh over fires to create jerky that could sustain them on hunting trips. The remnants of these feasts did not stay hidden. The tide, which so kindly hid their entrance, also served as their unwitting betrayer. Human remains, severed hands, mutilated feet, chunks of bone stripped of flesh, would wash up on the shores of neighboring villages. The locals were horrified, but the corpses were so mangled and waterlogged that the authorities assumed they were the work of wild animals or shipwrecks. The Beans were careful, but nature was not. Eventually, the sheer volume of missing persons began to create an unbearable tension in the lowlands. The investigation, hysteria, and injustice. For years, the local authorities of Ayrshire and Galloway were baffled. People were vanishing along the coast road with a frequency that made travel a gamble with death. Yet, no matter how many search parties scoured the moors, they could find no trace of the perpetrators. In their desperation to bring peace to the terrified populace, the magistrates turned to a brutal form of guesswork. In one of the most tragic ironies of the legend, the murderous Beans escaped justice while innocent innkeepers were hanged. Since many of the missing were last seen drinking at a local tavern or spending the night at a roadside inn before continuing their journey, The authorities assumed the innkeepers must be the killers. The logic was as twisted as it was fatal. The victim was last seen there. Therefore, the landlord must have buried them. A wave of lynchings swept the coast. Terrified of being the next scapegoat, many legitimate innkeepers abandoned their businesses and fled, leaving the roads even more desolate, and even easier pickings for the Bean clan. The straw that broke the camel's back. The clan's incredible luck finally ran out on a night they attacked a couple returning home from a local fair. The Beans ambushed them with their usual ferocity. The woman was quickly overpowered. In the most savage version of the story, recorded with relish in the Newgate calendar, the female Bean cannibals cut the woman's throat and fell to sucking her blood with as great a gust as if it had been wine, before disemboweling her. But the husband was a man of unexpected grit. A skilled fighter, he refused to go quietly. He grabbed a pistol and fought off the wave of cannibals, screaming for help. His shouts alerted a larger group of travelers returning from the same fair. Seeing the torches and hearing the growing mob of witnesses, the Bean clan fled back into the night. The husband, Salta, having witnessed the brutal death of his wife, did not seek refuge. He rode directly to the magistrates of Glasgow and reported the existence of a clan of cave-dwelling cannibals. The wrath of the king, the hunt for the cannibals. The news was too monstrous to ignore. It rippled through the Scottish court and eventually reached the ears of King James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England. Whether the king was motivated by justice or a hunter's bloodlust, the legend states that he organized the largest manhunt Scotland had ever seen. A force of 400 armed men was assembled, armed with torches, swords, and muskets. They were accompanied by a pack of savage bloodhounds, creatures trained to smell death over miles of rugged terrain. According to the story, King James himself, a keen hunter, joined the expedition, determined to root out the evil in his kingdom. The search party scoured the coast. They passed the hidden cave at Benan Head once before, but the stench of rot was so intense that the dogs became agitated. When a second search party forced their way into the narrow, dripping entrance of the cavern as the tide receded, what they found inside was the stuff of nightmares. The den of horrors. The discovery. The torches of the soldiers illuminated a scene of absolute human degradation. The floor was layered with the filth of decades, rotten straw, splintered bones, and the fetid remains of countless meals. The loot, the jewelry, the trinkets, the clothing of over 1,000 victims was piled in heaps in the corners, a grisly tribute to the dead. The smell of pickled flesh was overpowering. The air hummed with the buzzing of flies and the groans of the captured clan, who cowered in the dark recesses of the cave. The family did not fight. They were cornered animals, subdued by the sheer might of the king's force. They were dragged out into the light for the first time in a generation. The Beans were not handsome or noble in their wickedness. They were described as feral, malformed, with long, ragged hair and skin pale as a fish belly from decades without sunlight. They were the physical manifestation of sin. Every single family member was captured, bound in chains, and transported to the Tolbooth jail in Edinburgh to await their sentence. The reckoning, justice of the stake and knife. In Edinburgh, the court offered the Beans no trial. No judges debated their sanity. No lawyers argued for leniency. The execution was a spectacle of measure-for-measure vengeance. designed to be as brutal as the crimes they had committed. The soldiers hauled the Bean clan to the shore or the Mercat Cross, depending on the account, to face the bloodthirsty mob of Edinburgh. The men, Sawney, his sons, and his grandsons, were dragged to the center of the circle first. Their punishment was the death of a traitor. They were dismembered alive. Their hands and feet were severed, and they were left to bleed to death in front of the screaming crowd. The women and the younger children were forced to watch. When the last of the men had bled out, the flames were lit. The women of the Bean clan, including the matriarch Black Agnes, were burned alive at the stake. Sawney Bean did not repent. In the final telling, he is said to have watched his kin burn without a flicker of remorse, raging against his captors until the very end. The horrifying truth, fiction, propaganda, or reality. It is a spectacular story. It is also almost certainly a lie. The horrifying truth behind Scotland's cannibal family is that they likely never existed at all. For all the vivid details, the pickled limbs, the 200-yard cave, the hunt by King James, there is not a single shred of tangible historical evidence to support the tale. There are no royal court records of the manhunt, no ecclesiastical accounts of the trial, and no execution records for 48 cannibals being burned in Edinburgh. The absence of evidence is so loud that it rings like a bell. The oldest surviving copies of the story are not Scottish court documents. They are cheap English pamphlets printed in London in the early 18th century, circa the 1770s. This timing is crucial. The 18th century was a period of intense political turbulence between Scotland and England, marked by the Jacobite risings, attempts by Scottish Highlanders to restore the Stuart monarchy to the British throne. Propaganda was a weapon of war. English publishers routinely printed grotesque caricatures of the Scots, portraying them as barbarians, savages, and grotesque bogeymen. The name Sawney itself was not a real surname. It was an English slur, a diminutive nickname for Alexander, used by the English to mock and degrade the Scottish people. Calling a Scot a Sawney was the 18th century equivalent of a derisive ethnic slur. Historians like Dr. Louise Yeoman argue that the Sawney Bean myth was a deliberate piece of fake news, a schlock horror story designed to sell newspapers in London by feeding the English public's prejudice that their northern neighbors were a race of degenerate, inbred cannibals. It was the ultimate monster myth, the story of a people so backward that they would eat their own children in the dark. Furthermore, the publisher Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, is often suspected by scholars of having written or popularized some of these early crime pamphlets, lending a professional writer's touch to the macabre prose. The bones in the sand. Even though the historical truth suggests the bones were never there, the legend of Sawney Bean refuses to decay. The story is too powerful, too visceral to be killed by facts. It has burrowed into the cultural DNA, inspiring terrifying hillbilly horror films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Hills Have Eyes director Wes Craven explicitly cited Sawney Bean as the primary source for his script. Perhaps that is the real horror of Sawney Bean, the fear of the other, the terror of the neighbor in the cave, is a universal human nightmare. Whether the bones that washed up on the shore were real or just the imagination of a biased English pamphleteer, the truth remains. We want to believe in monsters. And as long as there is a dark coast and a hidden cave, the horrific truth of Sawney Bean will live on, not in the history books, but in the shiver that runs down your spine when you walk alone on a moonless night. The unburied truth, the bloodied legacy, and the cave that still whispers. The fire in Edinburgh's Mercat Cross had long turned to cold ash. Sawney Bean's severed limbs had been carried away by stray dogs, and Black Agnes's charred bones were scattered by the wind like a curse. For the terrified citizens of 18th century Scotland, the nightmare was supposedly over. The monster was dead. The dynasty was erased. The roads to the coast could be traveled again without a hand over the sword hilt. But the story of Sawney Bean refused to follow his corpse into the grave. It did not rot. It did not calcify into harmless history. Instead, it metastasized. Over the following centuries, the legend grew teeth it never originally possessed. New details were added. New victims were counted. The cave at Benane Head became a pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious, and the very name Sawney became a synonym for unspeakable backwoods depravity. Yet, as we dug deeper into the soil of truth, we discovered that the most horrifying revelation was not that the beans existed, but that they were never meant to be real in the first place. The geography of a ghost, searching for the cave. Let us begin where all good nightmares start. The place, the cliffs of Benane Head, south of Girvan in South Ayrshire, are a jagged, unforgiving coastline. The Irish Sea beats against them with a rhythm older than memory. On a calm day, the water is deceptively beautiful, a shifting palette of gray and green. On a stormy night, it is a black, roaring abyss. According to the pamphlets, the Bean Cave lay just above the high tide line, its entrance submerged twice a day. Locals have claimed for generations to know exactly where it is. Some point to a narrow fissure in the rock called the Devil's Arse, a name that tells you everything about local humor and local fear. Others insist the true cave collapsed during a landslide in the 19th century, sealing the horrors inside forever. In the late 1800s, a group of amateur antiquarians from Glasgow descended upon Benane Head with ropes, lanterns, and a great deal of whiskey. They found a sea-carved cavern, shallow and damp, no more than 30 feet deep. There were animal bones, sheep mostly, but no human remains, no barrels of brine, no piles of rusted jewelry. Disappointed, they declared the whole affair a fairy tale and went home to write a dismissive report. But the believers were not swayed. They argued that the amateur explorers had found the wrong cave. The real lair, they said, was deeper, sealed by a rockfall that only the most determined spelunker could bypass. As recently as 2010, a documentary team equipped with ground-penetrating radar scanned the cliffs. They found an anomaly, a void behind the rock, larger than the known caves, possibly large enough to house a family. But the tide and unstable geology made excavation impossible. So the cave remains a Schrodinger's monster, both empty and full, depending entirely on what you choose to believe, the body count. Inflation, how 1,000 victims became a legend. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Sawney Bean story is the sheer scale of the slaughter. The original broadsides speak of above 1,000 victims devoured over 25 years. Let us do that mathematics. 1,000 bodies across 25 years equals 40 people per year. That is one murder every 9 or 10 days, sustained for a quarter of a century, committed by a family of roughly 50 individuals, including small children and the elderly. To put that in perspective, the most prolific serial killers in history, operating alone, rarely exceed 50 confirmed victims. The Beans would have needed to kill and consume the equivalent of a small village every single year. And they did this without ever being caught, without leaving a trail of witnesses, without a single survivor until the very end. The answer, of course, is that the number is grotesquely inflated. In the 18th century pamphlet trade, more victims meant more sales. The London publishers knew that their audience did not want restraint. They wanted rivers of blood. So, a few dozen became several hundred, and several hundred became over 1,000. By the time the story reached Victorian England, some versions claimed 2,000 victims. This inflation serves a psychological purpose. The legend of Sawney Bean is not a history lesson. It is a morality play. The Beans are not supposed to be plausible. They are supposed to be a warning, a hyperbolic, terrifying warning about what happens when a family rejects God, King, and society. The body count is not evidence. It is liturgy. The horrifying truth revisited. Who really killed the travelers? If Sawney Bean did not slaughter 1,000 people along Galloway coast, then who or what was responsible for the very real disappearances that plagued the region in the 16th century? The answer is both more mundane and more chilling than a cave full of cannibals. The Scottish lowlands in the 1500s were a violent, lawless frontier. The border between Scotland and England was a blood-soaked no-man's land, infested with reivers, clan-based raiders who stole cattle, burned homes, and murdered anyone who got in their way. The reivers did not eat their victims, but they had no hesitation about leaving bodies in the ditches to rot. A traveler who vanished along the coast could easily have fallen victim to a cross-border raid, his corpse never recovered or identified. Additionally, the region was plagued by sorners, outlaw bands who lived outside the law, often in caves or shielings, surviving by robbery and extortion. These were real people, documented in court records. They killed, they stole, and they sometimes disappeared entire families. But they were not cannibals. They were simply desperate men and women, driven to the margins by poverty and war. The genius of the Sawney Bean legend is that it takes these real, scattered atrocities, the missing travelers, the lawless bands, the unexplored caves, and welds them into a single, monstrous narrative. The fiction is far more satisfying than the fragmented truth. The psychological horror. Why we need the Bean family. At this point, the careful reader might ask, if Sawney Bean is almost certainly a myth, why does it matter? Why write tens of thousands of words about a ghost? Because myths are not lies. Myths are truths wrapped in the skin of fiction. The Sawney Bean legend speaks to a very real, very primal terror, the fear of the family that has turned inward. Not just a murderer. We can understand a lone madman, but an entire bloodline dedicated to predation. A family that does not send its children to school, does not attend church, does not trade at the market. A family that exists only to consume. This is the terror of the hillbilly horror genre, from Deliverance to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to Wrong Turn. We fear the people in the isolated shack not because they are different, but because they are a dark mirror. They represent the terrifying possibility that civilization is only a thin membrane, and that if you stray too far from the town square, you might stumble into a place where the rules of humanity no longer apply. For the people of 18th century Scotland, recovering from the Jacobite rebellions and the brutal Highland clearances, the Bean family was a convenient scapegoat. They were not Scots, they were something else, something that had to be burned out. By exterminating the Beans, The king and his men were not just killing cannibals, they were purifying the land. Today, we do not burn people at the stake for imaginary cannibalism. But we still create monsters. We still tell ourselves stories about hidden families in dark places, the satanic cult in the daycare center, the cannibal in the forest, the trafficker in the tunnel. Almost always, these stories turn out to be exaggerated or entirely false. Yet the panic they generate is real. Sawney Bean is the example. He is the great-grandfather of every moral panic that ever swept a frightened nation. Modern echoes, the real cannibal families of history. If the Bean clan is a fiction, are there any real-life equivalents? Families who turn to cannibalism, not out of survival but out of ritual or preference? The answer is yes, though none on the scale of the legend. In 19th century Ireland, during the Great Famine, there are documented cases of families eating the dead, but those were acts of desperation, not depravity. In 20th century Russia, the murderous couple Andrei Chikatilo, the Rostov Ripper, was a lone wolf, not a family. In the United States, the Bender family of Kansas in the 1870s, known as the Bloody Benders, ran a small inn and murdered travelers, robbing them and dumping their bodies in a pit. They were 4 people, a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter. They may have killed a dozen or so people. They did not eat them, probably, and they were not a dynasty. The closest parallel to the Bean legend is actually a 21st century case, the Kirtland cult murders in Ohio 2017, where a woman named Earth Angel led a family-based group that starved children and fed their remains to other members. But again, the scale was small single digits, and the cannibalism was sporadic, not an industrial operation. The simple truth is that sustained, multi-generational, incest-based, purely predatory cannibalism is almost certainly impossible. The logistics alone, disposing of bones, hiding the smell, maintaining secrecy with dozens of participants, would guarantee capture within months. The Bean legend survives precisely because it could not have happened. It lives in the realm of the impossible, where our fears are free to roam without the pesky constraints of physics and forensics. The cultural aftermath, Sawney Bean in art, film, and music. The story of Sawney Bean never stayed in the pamphlets. It crawled into every corner of popular culture, mutating as it went. In literature, the legend directly inspired Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped, not the main plot, but the atmosphere of dread that clings to the Scottish coastline. H.P. Lovecraft referenced the Beans in his essay Supernatural Horror in Literature, recognizing them as a perfect fusion of Gothic and folk horror. Sir Walter Scott, the great chronicler of Scottish history, dismissed the story as vulgar fiction, but admitted that he had heard it told with such conviction by old Highlanders that he almost believed it himself. In cinema, the DNA of Sawney Bean is everywhere. Wes Craven, creator of The Hills Have Eyes, explicitly stated that the Bean family was the primary inspiration for the cannibalistic Jupiter clan in his 1977 film. The 1970s British horror film The Flesh and Blood Show features a direct adaptation. More recently, the 2021 Scottish folk horror film The Cursed, also known as 8 for Silver, includes a subterranean cannibal family, clearly modeled on the Beans. Even music has been touched by the legend. The Scottish folk band The Corries recorded a ballad called The Ballad of Sawney Bean, which they performed live with a dark, almost humorous reverence. Heavy metal bands, Macabre, Cannibal Corpse, and the misfits have all written songs about the clan. The story's lurid imagery, the pickled limbs, the sea cave, the burning of the women fits the genre like a severed hand fits a velvet glove. Visiting the cave. Today, a travelogue of unease. If you're ever driving the A77 coastal road from Girvan to Ballantrae, you might decide to pull over and look for Sawney Bean's cave. The road is narrow, lined with gorse and heather, and the sea glints through the gaps in the rock. There's a lay-by at Bennin Head, marked by a simple sign. Sawney Bean's Cave Historical Site, unofficial. Do not expect a visitor center. Do not expect a gift shop selling tiny barrels of pickled fingers, though that would be a morbidly funny tourist trap. All you will find is a steep, slippery path down the cliff face, a warning sign about the tide, and the mouth of the sea. If you descend at low tide, and you absolutely should check the tide tables, or you risk a drowning that would make the Beans proud, you will see the cave. It is not the gaping maw of legend. It is a crack, a cleft, a shadow in the stone. You can enter it if you are thin and brave. The floor is wet with salt water and littered with modern trash beer cans, wrappers, the occasional burned candle left by a ghost hunter. Standing inside that cave with the sound of the sea echoing behind you and the darkness pressing in, you understand why the legend endured. The place feels wrong. It feels like it should be empty, but it also feels like it could have been full. Your imagination, freed from the shackles of reason, fills the shadows with the movement of pale, inbred children. You smell brine and old rot, even though there is none. You hear a whisper that is only the wind. This is the power of the Sawney Bean myth. It colonizes real geography and makes it haunted. You do not need to believe the story to feel the story. The cave does the work for you. We have walked a long road from the damp soil of East Lothian to the blood-slicked floor of a Galloway cavern, from the burning stake in Edinburgh to the silver screen in Hollywood. We have sifted through the evidence, weighed the pamphlets against the court records, and listened to the defenders and the debunkers. So, what is the horrific truth behind Scotland's cannibal family? The horror is not that Sawney Bean existed. The horror is that we needed him to. We needed a monster to explain the missing travelers, because the real explanation, random violence, undetected murderers, accidental drownings, was too mundane, too scattered, too unsatisfying. We needed a name to shout at the darkness. Sawney Bean gave us that name. We needed a cautionary tale to tell our children. Stay on the road, keep to the light. Do not trust the family in the woods. Every culture has such tales. Scotland's is simply more graphic, more detailed, more deliciously terrifying than most. And finally, we needed a story that allowed us to feel righteous fury. The burning of the beans, the dismemberment of the men, the roasting of the women was not justice. It was entertainment. The crowd in Edinburgh did not cheer because they were safe. They cheered because they had watched evil die. The beans, real or not, gave them that catharsis. The most disturbing possibility is that Sawney Bean was never a person. He was a collective psychosis, a shared fever dream that swept through a frightened nation and then fossilized into history. The pamphlets were not reporting. They were manufacturing. And we, readers across 4 centuries, have been complicit in the lie, because the lie is better than the truth. The truth, that the Scottish lowlands were violent, as that people disappeared, that sometimes the killers were never caught, is bleak and boring. The myth, a dynasty of incestuous cannibals pickling limbs in a secret sea cave, is a work of grisly art. The Last Bean. There is one final thread to pull. A persistent local legend claims that not all the Beans died in Edinburgh. One child, a girl, no older than 4, was supposedly spared because the executioner could not bring himself to burn a babe. She was taken in by a family in Girvan, raised as their own, and given a new name. According to this whisper, her bloodline continues to this day, scattered across Ayrshire, unaware of the darkness in their ancestry. Genealogists have tried to trace this claim. They have found nothing, no adoption records, no baptismal anomalies, no DNA linking modern families to the Bean patriarch. But the rumor persists because it adds a final, exquisite layer of horror. The monster did not die. It merely went into hiding. The girl who survived grew up, married, and passed the tainted blood to her children. Somewhere, at this very moment, a descendant of Sawney Bean might be walking the streets of Glasgow, or drinking tea in a cottage by the sea. They do not know what their great-great-great-grandfather did. But the cave knows. The bones under the floor know. Or perhaps that is just another story, another whisper, another lie we tell ourselves because we cannot bear a clean ending. What we can say with certainty is this: the legend of Sawney Bean will outlive this essay, outlive the doubters, outlive the last historian who tries to bury it. It will be told around campfires for as long as there are campfires. It will be adapted into films and novels and songs that have not yet been written. It will evolve, shedding details that no longer frighten us, and growing new ones that do. Because the horrifying truth behind Scotland's cannibal family is not about cannibalism at all. It is about the human hunger for a story that makes the world feel wild again, a story where the rules of civilization do not apply, where the family in the cave is waiting, and where the only way out is through fire and blade. And deep down, in the oldest, darkest part of our brains, we are grateful for that story. We are grateful for Sawney Bean, because as long as we have a monster to name, we are not the monsters ourselves.